The rain came down in sheets that October evening in 1987, turning the narrow logging roads of Clatsop County into rivers of mud. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her parents' farmhouse outside Astoria, watching the Douglas firs sway violently in the wind. Her sister Claire and Claire's husband David were supposed to have arrived 3 hours ago. The roast chicken sat cold on the table, and Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed the sheriff's office for the 3rd time that night. Claire was 28, a schoolteacher with a laugh that could fill a room. David, 31, worked as a forestry technician for the state. They'd been married 4 years, and everyone who knew them said they were the kind of couple that restored your faith in love. That Friday, they'd driven from their small house in Seaside to visit Sarah and their aging parents, a routine trip they'd made dozens of times. The route was simple: Highway 101 along the coast, then inland through the dense forests that defined this corner of Oregon. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We bring you real stories that matter, stories that deserve to be remembered. By midnight, Sheriff Tom Hendricks arrived at the Mitchell farm with 2 deputies. He was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen his share of accidents on these treacherous roads. "We'll start searching at first light," he told the family, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying concern. "The storm's too bad to send anyone out now. Could be they pulled over somewhere to wait it out, lost in the dark." But Claire's father, Robert Mitchell, knew better. His daughter was cautious to a fault. If she'd had car trouble, she would have found a way to call. The coastal region had payphones at gas stations every few miles. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The search began Saturday morning with 20 volunteers from the community. They drove every inch of Highway 101 and the surrounding forest roads, looking for any sign of the couple's blue Toyota Camry. The Coast Guard even sent a helicopter to scan the areas where the road ran close to steep cliffs overlooking the Pacific. Days turned into weeks. The October rains gave way to November's cold, and still nothing. Sarah quit her job as a bank teller to coordinate the search efforts full-time. She plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole from Cannon Beach to Tillamook. Local newspapers ran stories with Claire and David's wedding photo, their smiling faces haunting every reader. Tips came in. Someone thought they'd seen a blue sedan at a rest stop near Manzanita. Another claimed to have passed them on the road, but each lead dissolved into nothing. The hardest part was the not knowing. Sarah would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she'd heard her sister's voice calling for help. Their mother, Helen, aged 10 years in a matter of months, her hair turning white as she sat by the window, waiting for a daughter who never came home. Robert organized weekend search parties that grew smaller as winter deepened and hope faded. The community wanted to help, but what could they do? The forests of Clatsop County stretched for hundreds of square miles, dense and unforgiving. By December, Sheriff Hendricks had to tell the family what they already knew in their hearts. "Without evidence of foul play or any sign of the vehicle, there's only so much we can do," he said, sitting in their living room with his hat in his hands. "I'm not giving up, you understand, but we've searched every logical place they could be." "What about the illogical places?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with desperation. The sheriff had no answer for that. He'd walked every accessible trail, questioned every resident along the possible routes, coordinated with state police and forestry services. The helicopter had flown grid patterns over thousands of acres. Divers had checked the rivers and coastal areas where the road came close to water. They'd even brought in dogs that had tracked scents to dead ends on muddy turnoffs. Everything pointed to the couple simply vanishing into the vast wilderness that surrounded them. Christmas that year was a funeral without a body. The family went through the motions, but the empty chairs at the table spoke louder than any prayer. Claire's classroom at the elementary school held a memorial service. and her students made cards that Sarah couldn't bear to open for months. The children had drawn pictures of their favorite teacher, written messages about how much they missed her smile. One little girl had written, "Mrs. Mitchell, please come back. We're waiting for you." David's colleagues from the Forestry Service conducted their own searches, knowing the woods better than anyone. These were men who'd spent decades working in these forests, who could navigate by landmarks invisible to outsiders. They checked old logging roads that didn't appear on any map, explored ravines and hollows where vehicles might have tumbled. They found nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed the couple whole. As 1988 arrived, the case grew cold in the official sense, though it burned hot in the hearts of those who'd known Claire and David. The local paper stopped running updates. The flyers faded and peeled away in the winter rain. People stopped asking Sarah how she was doing because they knew the answer and didn't know what else to say. The Mitchells existed in a terrible limbo, unable to grieve properly, unable to move forward, suspended in the awful space between hope and acceptance. Sarah kept searching anyway. Every weekend she drove the back roads with a map marked in red ink, documenting where she'd looked. She talked to hunters and hikers, loggers and fishermen, anyone who spent time in those woods. Most people were kind, patient with her questions, but she could see the pity in their eyes. They thought she was chasing ghosts, unable to accept what had become obvious to everyone else. After a year, even her parents gently suggested it was time to let go. "Let go of what?" Sarah would ask, her voice rising. "My sister, your daughter. They're out there somewhere, and everyone's just forgotten about them." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. People hadn't forgotten. They'd simply accepted what seemed inevitable. Claire and David had become another tragic statistic, another cautionary tale about the dangers of Oregon's rural roads and unpredictable weather. The prevailing theory was that they'd driven off the road in the storm, perhaps into a ravine or gully so remote that their car might never be found. The Pacific Northwest was filled with such places, where old-growth forest grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, where moss and ferns covered everything in a matter of weeks, where nature reclaimed human intrusions with startling speed. Every year, hunters and hikers went missing in these woods. Some were found eventually. Many never were. By 1989, Sarah had developed relationships with families of other missing persons across the state. She'd learned that there were dozens of cases like Claire and David's, people who'd simply vanished, leaving behind grieving families and unanswered questions. She started attending support group meetings in Portland, driving 3 hours each way to sit in church basements with strangers who understood her pain in ways her friends couldn't. It was at one of these meetings that she met Margaret Torres, whose son had disappeared while hiking near Mount Hood 2 years earlier. Margaret had the same haunted look that Sarah saw in her own mirror, the same desperate energy that came from refusing to give up. "You have to keep looking," Margaret told her over coffee after a meeting, "because the moment you stop, the moment you accept it, that's when you lose them forever." But Sarah was exhausted. The search had consumed her life, cost her job, strained her relationships. Her parents were getting older, their health declining under the weight of grief. Robert had suffered a minor heart attack that spring, and the doctor had been blunt. Stress was killing him. Helen had developed a tremor in her hands and spent hours sitting by the phone, jumping at every ring, hoping for news that never came. By 1990, Sarah made the painful decision to move to Portland. She couldn't stay in Astoria, where every street corner held memories of her sister, where well-meaning neighbors would stop her at the grocery store to ask if there'd been any news. She found work at a non-profit organization that helped families of missing persons navigate the legal and emotional complexities of their situations. It was a way to channel her grief into something productive, to help others even if she couldn't help herself. Her parents stayed on the farm, growing quieter each year. Robert's heart continued to weaken, the doctors attributing it to his condition, but everyone knowing the truth. He was dying of a broken heart. Ellen tended her garden with mechanical precision, but the joy had gone out of it. The flowers bloomed and faded, seasons changed, and still their daughter didn't come home. The years accumulated like sediment, burying the case under layers of time and new tragedies. Sheriff Hendricks retired in 1992, handing over his badge and a filing cabinet full of cold cases to his successor, a younger man named Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was competent and well-meaning, but he'd inherited dozens of unsolved cases and limited resources. He reviewed Claire and David's file once, shook his head at the lack of evidence, and moved on to cases he might actually solve. Sarah kept a box of her sister's things in her Portland apartment: photo albums, letters, a sweater that still faintly smelled like Claire's lavender perfume. On the anniversary of the disappearance each October, she would take a few days off work and drive back to Astoria, retracing the route her sister should have taken that night. She'd stop at the same gas stations, walk the same stretches of roadside, searching for something everyone else had given up on finding. 7 years passed this way, each one harder than the last. The sharp edge of grief dulled into a chronic ache that Sarah carried everywhere. She dated occasionally, but couldn't commit to anyone, couldn't imagine building a future when her past remained so painfully unresolved. Her work at the non-profit became her life, helping other families navigate the same nightmare she was living. She became an expert in search techniques, missing persons databases, and the bureaucratic maze that families had to navigate when someone vanished. In March of 1994, the timber industry was reeling from new environmental regulations designed to protect the spotted owl and old-growth forests. Logging companies that had operated freely for decades now faced restrictions on where and how much they could cut. The regulations had sparked fierce debates across the Pacific Northwest, pitting environmentalists against loggers, government officials against local communities. Jobs were disappearing, and small timber towns were dying. One of these companies, Cascade Timber, held contracts for selective logging in the Clatsop State Forest, an area that included some of the oldest and largest trees in the region. The new regulations meant they could only harvest trees that were dead, dying, or posed safety hazards. It was a fraction of what they'd cut in previous years, but it was work, and in 1994, work was precious. Tom Reeves was a third-generation logger, a man in his early 40s who'd spent his entire life in these woods. His grandfather had worked these same forests in the 1920s, his father through the boom years after World War II. Tom had grown up climbing these trees, learning to read the forest the way city kids learned to read street signs. He respected the woods even as he made his living from them, understanding that they were borrowing from something ancient and deserving of reverence. That March morning, Tom's crew was tasked with removing several hazardous trees marked by forestry officials, dead or dying giants that posed risks to hikers and the surrounding healthy forest. The work was dangerous and required precision. These massive trees, some over 300 years old, could weigh dozens of tons. If they fell the wrong way, people could die. The tree in question was a Douglas fir that Tom estimated at over 300 years old, its trunk 10 feet in diameter at the base. It had been struck by lightning sometime in the previous decade, and the damage had caused internal rot. From the outside it looked majestic, but Tom could see the telltale signs of decay, the way certain branches had died, the pattern of bark peeling, the sound the trunk made when he struck it with a hammer. It was dying from the inside out, and eventually it would come down on its own, possibly crushing the old Forest Service road that ran nearby. The tree stood on a slight rise about 50 yards from that road, an unpaved track that hadn't seen regular maintenance in years. Hikers used it occasionally, and hunters during deer season, but mostly it was forgotten. one of hundreds of such roads that crisscrossed the state forests. Tom's crew set up their equipment carefully, calculating the fall line, clearing the area, making sure everything was ready for the controlled drop. As they began cutting into the base, making the undercut that would determine which direction the tree would fall, Tom noticed something odd. The root system, exposed where erosion had carved away the soil on the downhill side, seemed to have wrapped around something large and angular. At first, he thought it might be a boulder. The roots of old trees often grew around rocks, splitting them over decades or incorporating them entirely. But the color was wrong. Through the dirt and decaying organic matter, he could see patches of what looked like faded blue paint. Tom stopped cutting and walked around to the downhill side of the tree. The roots here were massive, some as thick as a man's torso, and they'd created a complex network that held the hillside in place. But as he looked closer, crouching down in the soft earth, he realized that the roots had grown around something that definitely wasn't natural. The shape was too regular, too geometric, and that blue color, it was metal. Specifically, it was painted metal, corroded and covered in moss, but unmistakably manufactured. "Hold up," Tom called to his crew, raising a hand. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The roots had completely enveloped whatever this was, growing over and around it, like the tree was trying to digest some foreign object. He pulled out a knife and carefully scraped away some of the moss and dirt, revealing more of the blue surface. And then he saw it, the curved edge of what could only be a vehicle's roof. Tom's hands shook as he radioed his supervisor. "You need to get out here," he said, his voice tight, "and call the sheriff. I think we've found a car." The supervisor, a man named Pete Hansen, who'd worked with Tom for 20 years, thought it was a joke at first. People didn't lose cars in the middle of the forest, but Tom's tone made it clear this was serious. Within 2 hours, the site was crawling with deputies and forestry officials. Sheriff Pruitt arrived in his patrol car, parking on the old service road and hiking down to where Tom waited by the massive Douglas fir. When Pruitt saw what the roots had embraced, his face went pale. He'd reviewed hundreds of case files in his 2 years as sheriff, and he'd seen the photos in the Mitchell file more times than he cared to remember. A blue Toyota Camry, disappeared October 1987. "We're going to need specialized equipment," Pruitt said, already pulling out his radio. "And someone get me the Mitchell file from the office, now." The excavation was delicate, complicated work. The tree's roots had literally grown through the vehicle, penetrating the windows and doors, wrapping around the chassis. A team from the State Forestry Department arrived with specialized saws and cutting equipment. They couldn't just yank the car out. The roots held it too tightly, and they needed to preserve as much evidence as possible. This was a death scene, a crime scene in the sense that they needed to document everything, even if the only crime was nature's relentless claim on human artifacts. It took 3 days of careful work. They cut away roots piece by piece, removed soil bucket by bucket, slowly revealing more of the vehicle. It was indeed a blue Toyota Camry, tilted at a steep angle, its front end lower than the rear. The windshield was gone, long since shattered, and the interior was filled with years of decomposed leaves, small branches, and the dark soil that the forest produced. Moss grew on every surface. Small ferns had taken root in what had been the back seat. The license plates, though corroded almost beyond recognition, were still attached to the rear bumper. When they finally managed to read the numbers and run them through the database, the result came back immediately. Claire and David Mitchell, reported missing October 16th, 1987. Last known location, somewhere between Seaside and Astoria, Oregon. Sheriff Pruitt made the call himself. He'd done this kind of thing before, delivering terrible news to families, but never quite like this. 7 years. 7 years of not knowing, of hoping, of slowly dying inside. He dialed the number Sarah had listed as her current contact, a Portland address. Sarah was at work when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of a client meeting, helping a family file paperwork for their missing teenage son. But something made her excuse herself and pick up. When Sheriff Pruitt identified himself and said he had news about Claire and David, the world seemed to tilt sideways. She heard the words, found, vehicle, remains, Clatsop State Forest, but they didn't quite make sense, like a language she'd once known but had forgotten. "Where?" she managed to ask. "Where were they?" Pruitt gave her the coordinates, described the location. About 3 miles from where the main highway intersects with Forest Service Road 202. There's an old unpaved road there, barely maintained. They went off that road during the storm, down an embankment. The car came to rest against a large Douglas fir. "But we searched there," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We searched everywhere. How could we have missed them for 7 years?" "Ma'am," Pruitt said gently, "I need you to come out here. You need to see this to understand. It's like nothing I've ever encountered in 30 years of law enforcement." Sarah didn't remember the drive to Astoria. One moment she was in her Portland office, gripping the phone, and the next she was standing at the edge of that forest, being led down a trail by a deputy. She could see the activity ahead. Vehicles, people in uniforms, the bright yellow tape that marked off the area. And then she saw the tree. It was massive, ancient, its trunk so wide that 5 people holding hands couldn't encircle it. And at its base, partially freed from the root system but still held by thick, woody tendrils, was the car. Her sister's car. The blue Toyota that Claire had been so proud of, that she'd saved 2 years to buy, that should have brought her safely home that October night. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, moving closer. The roots had grown completely over the vehicle, wrapping around it like fingers, pulling it down into the earth. If you'd walked past this tree even a month ago, you would never have known the car was there. Nature had swallowed it whole, hiding it with patient, inexorable growth. Sheriff Pruitt appeared at her side. "We believe they went off the road during that storm," he explained gently. "This old service road was unpaved back then, and in that rain it would have been like driving on ice. They probably lost control, broke through what little guardrail existed, and went down the embankment. The car rolled, came to rest here against the tree. In the dark, in the rain, it would have been invisible from the road." But the searches," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the car. "We had helicopters. We had people walking every trail." Pruitt nodded, understanding her confusion and pain. "This spot is in a depression, a natural hollow. From above you can't see it. The tree canopy is too thick, and from the road there's no sight line. The car landed in essentially a blind spot." He paused, then continued, "But that's not why we didn't find them. The tree roots, ma'am. They grow fast, especially Douglas firs. The forestry experts estimate that within 3 to 6 months of the crash, the roots would have started growing over the vehicle. Within a year, it would have been substantially covered. By the time our search teams came through this area, the car was already being incorporated into the tree's root system." Sarah tried to process this. The tree had hidden them, not deliberately, just doing what trees do, growing, spreading roots, seeking nutrients and stability. The crash had placed the car in exactly the right position to be embraced by this ancient organism, and nature had simply continued its work, oblivious to the human tragedy it was concealing. Her parents arrived an hour later, Robert leaning heavily on Helen as they made their way down the trail. They'd aged dramatically in the 7 years since Claire's disappearance, but now they seemed to shrink even further, the weight of final knowledge crushing them. They stood together, holding each other, staring at the impossible sight before them. "They were here the whole time," Helen said, her voice barely audible. "All those searches, all those years, and they were right here, just a few miles from home. The forensic team from the State Crime Lab worked throughout that week, carefully excavating and documenting everything. They removed remains. Sarah couldn't think of them as bodies, couldn't connect those bones to the sister who'd taught her to braid hair, who'd helped her study for tests, who'd danced at her own wedding with such joy that everyone had cried happy tears. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office in Portland for formal identification and analysis. The report came back 2 weeks later, confirming what everyone already knew. The dental records matched Claire and David Mitchell. The forensic analysis showed that both had died from injuries sustained in the crash, Claire from severe head trauma, David from massive internal injuries. The medical examiner estimated they died either on impact or within minutes afterward. They hadn't suffered long. That was some small mercy, at least. The crash reconstruction team studied the vehicle and the scene, piecing together those final moments. Based on the damage patterns and the car's final position, they determined that Claire and David had been driving well under the speed limit, probably no more than 20 miles per hour given the conditions. They'd hit a section of the unpaved road where water had washed away much of the gravel, creating a slick mud surface. The car had hydroplaned, all 4 wheels losing traction simultaneously, and David had done exactly what you're supposed to do: steered gently, didn't brake hard, tried to regain control. But on that narrow, unpaved forest road, with a steep embankment on one side and thick woods on the other, there'd been nowhere to go. The car had slid sideways, broken through the minimal cable guardrail that was all that existed on such roads back then, and tumbled down the 30-foot slope. It had rolled at least twice before coming to rest against the Douglas fir, landing in the hollow at the tree's base. The investigation revealed something else that haunted everyone involved. If the crash had occurred 50 feet in either direction, the car would have been visible from the road. If they'd gone over at a different angle, they might have hit trees on the way down that would have left visible damage. If the Douglas fir hadn't been in that exact spot, growing in that particular way, the car wouldn't have been swallowed by roots. A dozen tiny factors had combined to hide them perfectly. Sheriff Pruitt reviewed the original search records with new understanding. Teams had actually been within a quarter-mile of the crash site multiple times during those first weeks in late October and early November 1987. They'd driven the Forest Service road where the crash occurred. They'd walked trails that ran parallel to the embankment, but by then the tree's roots had already begun their work, and the combination of the depression, the dense undergrowth, and early root growth had made the car invisible. "We did everything right," Tom Hendricks told Pruitt when they met to discuss the case. The retired sheriff had aged in the 7 years since Claire and David's disappearance, his hair gone completely white, deep lines carved into his face. "I've gone over those search records 100 times since you called. We followed every protocol, covered every logical area. But this wasn't logical. This was nature doing something I've never seen before or since." The logging crew that had discovered the car became part of the story too. Tom Reeves gave interviews to local papers, describing what it had been like to realize what the tree roots had enveloped. "I've been working these forests for 25 years, he told one reporter. "I've seen trees grow through old machinery, around fence posts, over rock faces, but I've never seen anything like this. It was like the forest had decided to keep them, to hold them until it was ready to let them go." The funeral, 7 years delayed, took place on a grey April morning at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Astoria. The building couldn't hold everyone who came. Claire's former students, now teenagers, David's colleagues from the Forestry Service, neighbours and friends, people from the search parties who'd never stopped wondering. They filled the pews and stood in the aisles and gathered outside in the drizzle that seemed perpetual in this corner of Oregon. Sarah stood at the front, her hand resting on one of the twin caskets, and spoke about her sister. She'd written and rewritten her remarks a dozen times, trying to find words adequate to 7 years of grief, of searching, of the strange relief that came with finally knowing. Claire and David were coming home that night, she said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Coming to share dinner, to laugh with us, to be family. They never made it to our house, but they were never alone. They were together, and in a strange way, the forest protected them, kept them safe until it was time to bring them back to us. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the case that was picked up by papers across the Pacific Northwest and eventually by national news services. The image of the car encased in tree roots became iconic, symbolic of how nature could hide tragedy, how time could bury truth. Environmental scientists published papers about the case, noting that Douglas firs had particularly aggressive root systems and that the specimen in question had been in a period of vigorous growth during the years following the crash, which explained the rapid encasement. The story resonated with people in ways that went beyond the specific tragedy of Claire and David Mitchell. It spoke to larger questions about how the natural world interacted with human life, about the power of nature to both destroy and preserve, about how quickly the forest could reclaim what humans had made. Hikers and tourists began visiting the site, though the Forestry Service eventually closed the area to protect it from damage. Sheriff Pruitt used the case to advocate for better search technologies and protocols. He presented at law enforcement conferences, showing photographs of the root-wrapped car, explaining how traditional search methods had failed. "We need to think differently about how nature conceals evidence," he told audiences. "This won't be the last time something like this happens. We need ground-penetrating radar, better thermal imaging, new techniques for searching areas where vegetation growth is rapid." For Sarah, the discovery brought a closure she'd never thought possible, but also a profound and complicated sadness. She found herself thinking about all the times she'd driven past that area during her 7 years of searching, how she'd probably been within a few hundred yards of her sister without knowing it. She thought about the tree, growing year after year, its roots slowly enfolding the car like the forest was trying to heal a wound, or preserve evidence, or simply doing what trees do without any awareness of the human significance. She visited the site often in the months that followed, hiking down the trail that had been created by the investigation teams. The logging company, in an unusual gesture, had decided not to remove the Douglas fir after all. Once they'd extracted the car, they'd treated the lightning damage and reinforced the tree's stability. It had become part of the story, and somehow it felt wrong to cut it down. A simple memorial plaque was placed at the base, noting that Claire and David Mitchell had rested there, held by the forest, until they could come home. Robert Mitchell's health, already precarious, declined rapidly after the funeral. The knowledge that had sustained him for 7 years, that somewhere, somehow, his daughter might still be alive, was gone. Replaced by the certainty of death, his heart simply gave up. He died in his sleep 6 months after Claire and David's burial, and everyone who knew him understood that he'd been dying slowly since that October night in 1987. The official cause was heart failure, but the real cause was grief. Helen followed 2 years later, in the spring of 1996. She'd maintained the farm alone after Robert's death, tending her garden with the same mechanical precision she'd developed over the years. But the life had gone out of her. She died quietly, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, where she'd spent so many hours watching for a daughter who would never return. Sarah found her there, a peaceful expression on her face, as if death had finally released her from an unbearable weight. Sarah buried her parents in the plot next to Claire and David at the Astoria cemetery. The 4 headstones stood in a row, a family reunited after being torn apart. She would visit regularly, bringing flowers, sitting on the grass, talking to them about everything that had happened, everything they'd missed. The conversations were one-sided, but they helped her process the magnitude of what had been lost. She continued her work with missing persons' families, bringing to it a deeper understanding of what it meant to exist in that liminal space between hope and acceptance. She'd lived there for 7 years, and she knew its geography intimately. The false optimism of new leads, the crushing disappointment when they dissolved, the exhaustion of keeping hope alive day after day. She'd learned that sometimes answers came in the most unexpected ways, and that nature had its own timeline for revealing truth. The story of the couple found beneath the tree roots became part of Clatsop County's history, taught in schools alongside other local legends and tragedies. It became a reminder of how unpredictable and powerful nature could be, how quickly the forest could hide evidence, how small factors could combine to create perfect concealment. Search and rescue teams across Oregon studied the Mitchell case, incorporating its lessons into their training. They learned to look for depressions and hollows, to consider how vegetation might grow over evidence, to use new technologies that could see beneath the surface. On October evenings, when the rain came down and the wind moved through the trees the way it had that night in 1987, Sarah would sometimes drive out to the site. She'd stand beneath the massive Douglas fir, listening to the forest, and talk to her sister about everything that had happened, everything she'd missed. The tree stood silent and solid, its roots running deep into the earth, holding more than just soil and stone. It held memory, it held loss, and in its own way, it held love, preserved and protected beneath the surface until the world was ready to receive it again.